Welcome to the Gaudium et Spes podcast, where every other week we bring you Catholic teachings and stories of faith from people throughout the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Now, here are your hosts, Suzanne McNinch and Ches Filippini.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Gaudium et Spes podcast. As always, please check out our last episode where Dr. Luke and Ches were together on another episode of Catholic Social Teachings. It was really incredible, so please listen in. It's great to be back here in the studio. I know it's been a while since I've been here, Ches. Woo! But
My gosh.
I know. Thank you. It's good to see you again. But we're here for another series with Bishop Wack on, actually, this one's going to be on St. Francis of Assisi. It's part 1 of 2. And, just an incredible saint and a major, person in many people's lives and saints that they, talk to, read a lot about, study. And this is the year of Francis,
That's
so
right.
It's perfect.
Yeah, Bishop's going on pilgrimage in about a month and a half to celebrate this special Jubilee year along with the USCCB. So we thought we'd do a little bit of a deep dive in honor of the Jubilee year and his trip. We might get a bonus episode from Assisi itself.
Nice.
If we play our cards right. Derek's going to be along, our producer, on this one as well. So pray for that intention. That would be an epic finale to the series. But yeah, definitely 1 of 2 for now. It's been so long though, Suzanne.
Yes.
If reports of our breakup here as podcast partners have been overblown. Been circulating on the internet. It's just been so busy. It's been like trying to consolidate our schedules, be in the same place with our guests. It's been nuts, but it's going to be back.
Same.
Let's get the quote running. We haven't done the quote in forever. The joys, the hopes, griefs, and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys, the hopes, the griefs, and anxieties of the followers of Christ. So a lot of catch up. What the heck's been going on?
Oh my gosh. I can't believe it's almost the end of summer and school started already. This is amazing, right?
Is it amazing?
It is.
My wife last night was like, why do we do this? As we got an email about our daughter's shoes not meeting the school dress code. We love you, Sacred Heart. But it was like, Kelly was like, take me back to the last week already. Anyhow, It is amazing.
I know. Well, my daughter, my youngest, her last year of college.
Dang.
So, yeah, I know. This is kind of the cycle of it is sort of coming to an end for me, which is really surreal. I was in Target on Sunday with my husband and, thankfully I could just walk by the school supply section. I didn't even have to stop and buy anything this year. But, I saw hundreds of other people there, vigorously trying to get everything that they needed from their list. But it's a special time of the year. It just is, it's fun.
Did you throughout college, have you bought clothes for and sent them as a care package at the beginning of the school year or anything like that?
Well, actually, the weekend before she left, we took a trip over to Destin and hit the outlets and a bunch of other stores over there. And so it was just her and I.
That's
and got back home and, my husband was like, oh, so you spent blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, well, sorry. Kind of, I guess. Wasn't really thinking about it. But yes, we did back to school shopping even then.
Oh, my
so,
gosh.
Yep.
You'll be doing back to school shopping for some grand codas in no time, I bet. I shouldn't. That's a prediction,
Yes.
not an announcement or anything.
I would love that someday.
Yep.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so. But no, I've just been busy here at work. My folks go to Biloxi every summer and rent a condo there. So we're actually headed there this weekend to see them again. And my son and his girlfriend will drive down from Memphis. So we'll all be there together, which is really nice. And yeah, we've had some friends visit over the summer and things like that. So kind of just, keeping busy.
Good.
Gearing up for football season here. And
Good
woohoo.
grief. Oh, gosh. We're not talking about it yet. Guys, we're not talking about it yet. Florida State fans, we're never going to talk about it.
Yeah,
We're hoping for the worst, predicting the even worst. So
Oh, no.
it's going to be great.
Yeah. Well, what about you guys? Did you take a big summer trip this year?
No, we did our usual. We did 2 separate trips down to Central Florida, visited family.
Okay.
It was a great time. Did some fishing this past weekend. We went over to the right on the edge of Fort Pickens on the Sound side and got some frozen shrimp and frozen sand fleas and just caught a bunch of pinfish and stuff.
Love it.
Got destroyed with sunburn, and my wife was like, it was probably the highest UV index of the entire summer when you went out, but I was like, I promise I put sunscreen on them, but they got in the water too quick, so it was really good.
That's
but no,
good.
We're back in school. The swing of things is on. Sophomore in high school, 5th grader, 2nd grader, and then VPKers. So
Wow.
all hands on deck.
Yep.
It's going to be great.
Nice.
We're shifting in, guys. As Suzanne already said, this is a special series on one of the greatest. He might be the GOAT of all saints of this millennium. I'll just say that, guys. The first millennium of the church, the martyrs, the apostles, they got that on lockdown. But this second millennium of the church, there might not be anybody bigger who has made a greater impact on more people and inspired more people than St. Francis of Assisi. So we're going to turn you over to Bishop to hear about his life, his biography, and we'll talk to you on the other side.
As we are in the year of St. Francis, I want to spend some time talking about this great saint, one of the greatest saints in our church. I want to talk about this over 2 episodes. The first one, I'll talk a little bit about the history. First of all, the milieu in which he was born, in which he started the Franciscans and ministered. And then in the second episode, I want to talk about Franciscan spirituality, famous Franciscans, how we can, continue that legacy and live our faith in that vein, in the vein of St. Francis, and with his intercession from heaven. He truly is, I say, one of the most powerful saints. They're all powerful, of course. They're all glorious in heaven. But as far as we are concerned here on earth, the one who is quoted the most, perhaps, or referred to the most, even and especially by popes and encyclicals, seems to be Pope Francis. You also think of St. Patrick, you think of St. Teresa of Lisieux, you think of some modern day saints, Carlo Acutis, and no doubt that he will be also referenced much, much more even in the future. But St. Francis, over the years, 800 years, has been referred to, has been cited, has been looked to as a model of simplicity and humility and deep, abiding faith in Jesus Christ and an adherence to Jesus Christ. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's what I want to talk about. This is, we are currently in the year of St. Francis. It is 800 years after his death. So Pope Leo announced it this year. It's interesting. We had a Pope Francis, of course, who would have loved to have announced a year of Francis. But it worked out that his successor, Pope Leo XIV, announced that. So we're in that. It seems very timely that we ought to talk about this great saint. So, okay, this first episode I want to talk about, as I said, kind of the background and the history of and the significance of St. Francis. First of all, the background, and this is really important. So remember, we're talking about the 12th, 13th century here. And it was a time of, it's always a time of renewal and growth in the church, it seems, In fact, just as I did a little research for this with the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, I was thinking about our own time and what led to, reforms in our church and our world in the Second Vatican Council. It was the same thing, it seems. It's the church desiring to come back to Jesus Christ. And not that we ever left Christ or he ever left the church, of course, but it seems that, just being human, we tend to get distracted, perhaps. Things seem to happen. We embrace certain practices and we get, like I said, maybe distracted just a bit from Jesus Christ. That's a little harsh, but, it seems like we need to be called back to that again and again. And then that's what St. Francis did in his time. It was a time of, a lot of division and wars and violence, not unlike our time, but also, there was corruption, not just in the church, but especially just in society. There were new methods of obtaining money, of selling goods, and the middle class started to rise. Before that, it was mostly agrarian, and people were servants. The majority of the world seems were servants of other people. Well, now there was, another class that was arising, and people were making money, and they were trading and building, and the population was thus growing. and cities were being founded and all of that. Big churches were being built and everything. So it was a time of great growth and all of that. And the church, was not immune to some of this. And again, as I said, maybe some in the hierarchy and the faithful got distracted and focused a little more on power and authority and great buildings and all of that, and self-importance. And so Francis was not alone, but was one to rise up to say, we need to reform ourselves and get back to the Gospels, get back to Jesus Christ, and the radical discipleship that he calls for all of us. And so around that time, the church was experiencing, as I said, much needed reform, and that's a good thing. Some of the good aspects that came out of that, the church clearly said that simony, that is selling sacred offices or spiritual matters or masses, things like that, is clearly wrong. You can't do that. You can't benefit financially from selling spiritual goods or things or offices. I know it sounds pretty obvious for us today, but that was a problem back then in society and in the church. And so that was eradicated for the most part. Also, there was a time when we were really focusing on priestly celibacy, forbidding priestly marriage, and really reforming the priesthood as well, calling priests again to holiness more than, first of all, more than anything else, and then rededication to the sacraments and to ministry. As I said, one of the more challenging things is at that time, the church grew in power and authority, and the Pope even grew in authority and recognition among the kings and queens of the earth. He became like a king, and that brings a bunch of other problems and temptations and everything else. As I said, there was a time of great growth in population and the economies in Italy and elsewhere, and that helped the church as well to expand in influence and expand around the world. The market system was beginning to be established in cities, and merchants had opportunities to do well for themselves and their families. That's very good, but riches tend to have a corrupting effect on people. And the scriptures were more accessible. Because they were more educated, they were reading more, and so they had access to the scriptures. And for some, they hadn't heard certain aspects of the gospel or hadn't considered the life of Jesus, for instance, and how radically he lived and what he calls us, how he calls us to live. And so there was a renewed desire to follow Jesus more radically as well at that time. And this led to the establishment of many monastic and mendicant orders at the time. Some were put off by the excesses and abuses they witnessed, and so they looked to the Gospels with fresh eyes at that time. St. Francis then was born in the year 1181 or 1182, we're not exactly sure, but right around then. He was the son of a successful cloth merchant. Like I mentioned, there was a rise of the middle class, and Francis's father was part of that and was doing well for himself, making a name for himself, selling, as I said, merchandise, cloth, etc. In the early years, Francis worked with his father and lived there, of course, in the home in Assisi. And as Pope Benedict XVI later said, that he had a carefree adolescence and youth and dreamt of glory and chivalrous adventure, around the world. He was just like a lot of young people, hopefully today. We hope to be obedient, grow up in a family, and you dream of going on an adventure and things like that. Francis was no different. In 1202, Francis went away to fight for Assisi against Perugia. Assisi was soundly defeated in that battle, and Francis was captured. He spent about a year in captivity, which is very important in his own formation and his faith life. He was ransomed by his family at the cost of, at a large cost. But at that time, he had plenty of time to think about, his life, even faith, and God. God, we believe, was planting seeds of what he would later do during that time. Back home, Francis was changed. He still, had those dreams of glory and all of that, but He wasn't so interested in making money or, leaving a legacy for himself. And he started to live a little bit more life of a hermit. He was pulling away from his family, if you will. Something was stirring within him. He sets out for another battle in 1204, and on the way he had a dream that Jesus told him to reprioritize his life. He returns to Assisi and moves towards a more radical Christian way of life, as I said. He had several famous encounters there, an encounter with a leper at one point. He was like everyone else, I think, of his time. He used to, just be terrified of lepers and leprosy because it was incurable and it was highly contagious, this disease, this affliction. And yet something moved him at one point to dismount from his horse when he saw someone there on the road who had leprosy and embraced him and kissed him. It was a very radical thing to do, but it really represents and shows us how much Francis desired to make that change in his life and how he felt God calling him to really live radically the gospel. And then at a little chapel there outside of Assisi, San Damiano, the church, it was dilapidated. It was old and kind of, falling down a little bit. There, Francis went in and he heard God's voice. It is said 3 times God said to him and spoke. It's as though, he said, the crucifix there spoke to him, and he saw Christ speaking to him from there. And God said, basically, Francis, rebuild my church, which, as you can see, is falling into disrepair. Now, Francis took that literally, of course, because he could see that that little chapel was falling into disrepair. It was in ruins. And so he spent a lot of time, rebuilding that church and other little chapels in the area and churches. He took it very literally. But of course, what he discovered later and what we know, maybe he knew at the time, is that God was saying, not just my church buildings, but my church, which is falling into disrepair. And so, but he started doing that literally at that little church. And then, so around that time, 1205, 1208, he embraced an itinerant life. He was begging for alms. He was repairing churches. He begins caring for, as I said, those with leprosy. Some people were attracted to his way of life and now started to follow him and do the same thing. At that time, he disavowed then his father's business and wealth. His father was complaining, no doubt for years, that he was spending too much time in those churches doing other things other than working and making money for him, and that he was too dedicated to the poor, as it were. But Francis then, at some moment, stripped off his clothes in the middle of the plaza there, very publicly in Assisi, and he renounced his father's wealth and walked away. He wanted to just leave everything. By stripping off his clothes, it is said, he really was renouncing his inheritance and everything and just walking away. And then, as I said, he started to attract his first followers around that time. In 1208, Francis at a Mass hears the gospel passage of Jesus sending out his disciples 2 by 2. And again, he took that very literally. So he and his followers wanted to emulate that, and they went out 2 by 2 all around, first in Italy, and then later on they expanded their missions to go even to France and other countries as well. Soon after that, Francis traveled to Rome to obtain approval for his rule of life. Pope Innocent III, who was reigning at the time, had a dream actually 2 years prior to this visit. Pope Innocent recounts a dream that he had where it was a very poor and small hermit or monk who was holding up the great church of St. John Lateran, the Archbasilica. And he had no idea what it meant, but it was falling down, and a little monk, a little person, a very humble person was holding up, a friar was holding up that large, immense building. So he had that dream 2 years prior. Then Francis comes 2 years later, and tells him of his dream and of his desire to start an order. That wasn't the main reason, but to reform the church from within, which naturally meant that he was going to start a movement, an order. He welcomed Francis and encouraged him to keep going. It wasn't fully approved at that point, but basically it was approved to be approved, if you will. Around that time, 1211, St. Clare joined Francis. There's a whole story about that. You must read about that. You must learn about that. But she had to flee her family. Her family thought she was losing her mind, of course, probably as many did, of these young men who left to follow Francis. I'm sure I can just imagine people saying, what is happening here? Why are all these young men doing this? And now Claire, someone who was probably pretty well known in that little town of Assisi, she left. Her uncles and her family was trying to restrain her at one point. And there's a legend that says she prayed to God and she became as heavy as, I don't know, like a slab of marble, and they couldn't hold her up anymore. And so she ran to Francis, and he received her then, and she started what is now known as the Poor Clares, an order, a Franciscan order that is closely attached to Francis. In 1212 to 1216, around that time, Francis and his followers continued to preach, as I said, throughout Italy, and then more followers. They went to France, etc., around 1217, and it was expanding, not blowing up or anything, but it was expanding. More and more people were coming. Just like the gospel, when Jesus was attracting people, just a few at a time, it seemed, and then he was sending them out. Francis was emulating that, was imitating that almost exactly, literally. In 1221, the order is more firmly established. Francis steps down as the head of the order, the superior, if you will, and he writes a more permanent rule for his followers. And again, now more and more people start to come. With his health declining, Francis returned to Assisi in the year 1226. Then, when death, he called it sister death in his famous canticle, was near, he returned to the Portiuncula, which is a little chapel there outside of Assisi. This was the foundation of the Franciscan order, if you will. This is where it started for him. The Benedictines had given him this care of this chapel after he repaired it and was praying there. And then thus he established the order there. And it's still present today, that little chapel within a large basilica of St. Mary of the Angels. And you can visit today, it's just a beautiful legacy. It's part of the treasury of the church, this tiny little thing in the midst of this massive basilica. But he asked to return to that place, which was his spiritual home in a sense. And then a few days later, he died, just stretched out on the bare floor. And he asked that immediately after his death, anything that he was wearing, that little garment that he was wearing, should be stripped from him. That's what he had asked. That's how he wanted to die, and he did. And, of course, ever since then, now for 800 years, and well into the future, I'm sure we will continue to honor him and revere him and call upon his intercession and his help. Francis, there's so many things, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, but so many things that we can learn from him, that simplicity, poverty, humility, a total dedication to Jesus Christ. And also, and this must be said too, Francis was a son of the church. He loved the church. I think there are some people who would like to think, he was such a reformer that he was saying, you don't need the church. All you need is Jesus, But that was not Francis. In fact, Pope Benedict XVI really took that issue on. And he said, there are some who try to reconstruct the historical Francis. And by that, it means it's kind of going through a forensic study in history and trying to imagine exactly what he was like. And some of those studies lead to people saying, well, yeah, it wasn't really about the church. He was kind of throwing off the church at the time. Not at all. You can see in his writings and in his actions that Francis loved the church and called people to obedience to the Pope and to the bishops, to a great love of the Eucharist and the sacraments of the church. There's a quote here from Pope Benedict XVI's, one of his teachings on Francis. I like this. He said, several 19th century and also 20th century historians have sought to construct a so-called historical Francis. That this historical Francis would not have been a man of the church, but rather a man connected directly and solely to Christ, a man that wanted to bring about a renewal of the people of God without canonical forms or hierarchy. But Francis, this is continuing what Benedict said, Francis placed himself fully with his heart in communion with the church, with the Pope, and with the bishops. He always knew that the center of the church is the Eucharist, where the body of Christ and his blood are made present through the priesthood, the Eucharist, and the communion of the church. And speaking of the Eucharist, he had a great love for the Eucharist, for adoration and receiving the Eucharist and celebrating the sacrifice of the Mass. As a Catholic, this is again, Pope Benedict XVI writes this. Francis's love for Christ expressed itself in a special way in the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament of the Eucharist. In his writings, one reads such moving expressions as this: "Let everyone be struck with fear, let the whole world tremble, and let the heavens exult when Christ, the Son of the living God, is present on the altar in the hands of a priest. O stupendous dignity, O humble sublimity, that the Lord of the universe, God and the Son of God, so humbles himself that for our salvation he hides himself under an ordinary piece of bread." I love that, and I think that's really important because we need to remember that, yes, he called us to renewal, and the church in every age has a need for renewal, of course, but it's not something that happens external to the church. It is a call that comes from within and a call to reform the structures of the church, but not the basic foundation of the church, Jesus Christ, the sacraments, the tradition of the church, the scriptures, etc. There is a need in every age, and as I mentioned a little while ago, even in our own age, leading up to the Second Vatican Council, and I talked about this in one of the early episodes of this podcast, but leading up to that, there was a desire, and it came from within the church, from bishops, yes, but also from priests, from the faithful, who said, we need to get back to Jesus Christ. We need to get back to the scriptures. We need to get back to remembering what, our foundation and where it came from, and to, if necessary, kind of shrug off some of the accretions, some of the things that we have added on to the faith that are distracting and that are not helpful and could lead to excess and abuse and things like that. So Francis was one among many in history who called us to do that in the around the 13th century. There are other things that we can talk about, and I will. I just want to say this also because we're talking about history. It was just 2 years after his death that Pope Gregory IX canonized him. There must have been a massive call for his canonization. Probably the day he died, the day people heard that he died, I'm sure they were storming Rome with, not literally perhaps, maybe, but just, with the call to canonize him. Francis certainly was pretty famous around that region at that time and would become one of the greatest saints, in time, known all throughout the world to Catholics, Christians, and non-Christians, and people of no faith at all. But that's pretty amazing. In this day and age, it takes a while to go through the canonization process, but it was just 2 years after his death in the year 1228 that he was canonized by Pope Gregory IX. Okay, so in the next episode, again, I'll talk about a little bit more about the spirituality, about famous Franciscans, and how we can continue this legacy to be people who love humility and poverty, who love the Lord, of course, who love creation, and who seek peace and justice and all of that, all of the things that Francis reminded us about, all of the things which he continues to intercede for us today. So may God bless you, and may St. Francis pray for us and inspire us to be more and more like Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome back. Gosh, I know this sounds like a broken record, but I think every time I listen to Bishop Bill, just do one of his teaching series, I feel just smarter. I mean, it's just amazing. Yeah. I mean, for me, the biggest thing is that, the next time I go to adoration, I'm really going to be thinking about St. Francis a lot more than I have in the past. And so, his love of the Eucharist and devotion just is enormous. But I know St. Francis is one of your favorites.
Yep.
Yes.
And we highlighted one of the quotes that I think Bishop and I talking beforehand about it. It was like the Pope speak about St. Francis in a way that's just different. Mm-hmm. So one of the quotes of Pius XI. So the last time we did a Jubilee on St. Francis was 1926, and 700 years after his death. Pope Pius XI said, "It seems necessary for us to affirm that there has never been anyone in whom the image of Jesus Christ and the evangelical manner of life shone forth more lifelike and strikingly than in St. Francis."
Wow.
Which is like, okay, never been anyone. We would reserve that maybe for the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Sure.
Yeah. But that's the impact he made. As Bishop talked about, he passed away. He was canonized within 2 years, because everyone was just dumbstruck by what had transpired before their eyes. One of the things Bishop mentioned, kind of skipped to the end a little bit there, but the last couple of years of his life, one of the most striking things that happened is St. Francis became imprinted with the stigmata. So this phenomenon that has fascinated even Hollywood. I think there was a movie about it in the late 90s or something like that. This imprinting of the wounds of Christ on some saints. Francis was the first one that ever happened to. So there's been a string of several dozen, even maybe in the hundreds after him. But no one had ever seen that up until that point in time, at least in the church's tradition. It's never been documented, that the living wounds of Christ were present on his hands and his side, on his feet, in 1224 to his death. So that was kind of the confirmation that everyone knew already, but it was like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, at the time, the lives he impacted. I mean, we just recently, celebrated the feast day of St. Clare of Assisi, who we know was very, very close and influential and influenced by him at that time. But, I think his story is fascinating in the fact that, he abandoned his family. And I don't mean that in a negative sort of way, but
he did.
I mean, yeah. And they thought he was crazy and mad. Like, why would you be doing this?
Did.
And but he didn't leave because, he couldn't talk to them or they were having issues or anything else like that. No, it was for the love of God and for the calling that he had.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's so courageous. I mean, envy and awe, honestly.
And there's some things about Francis we don't, because he's a saint, so many saints that we look up to, they leave behind a corpus of writings. And you can you read their lives by what they wrote. Essentially, something like St. Augustine. There's millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of words that he spoke, and you can read, and they dictated. You get his brain. You get a picture of a brain. St. Thomas Aquinas, our popes, all these kinds of things. Francis, though, has a couple of handwritten letters that have been preserved. He has the Rule of St. Francis, but you really only know him kind of like Jesus, which is through the stories about him, the sheer shock value that he had on people, that they were like, I have to follow him and write him down, because the striking there's almost a theater about his life. When he abandoned his father, he stripped himself naked in the Piazza of Assisi, and then went, and the Bishop of Assisi clothed him in his robe so that it would be a modest moment. That's a sort of the insanity of his life. There's so many dramatic moments that we can't even cover. His commitment to penance was just so outrageous. There's a story I read recently where he felt guilty about not having done a significant amount enough of penance during winter. And he was kind of having a moment where he had a craving for a family. He stripped himself naked in the winter when there was snow on the ground and made snowmen. And
oh my gosh.
started talking to them and having a prayer moment where it was essentially like, look at your family, Francis. This is the Lord, what the life that the Lord has given you not good enough? Enjoy your family out here. Just kind of like throw himself into rose bushes full of brambles and thorns and making people just so many stories where the people around him were clearly like, oh, this is what it means to follow the gospel. You know? One of the last one, the one I just cackle at in my brain is he went away for a trip. So the Porzioncolo that Bishop mentioned, this little chapel at the bottom of the hill in Assisi, which is just a stunning place to Pope Leo just celebrated Mass there. Francis was serious, like, we are homeless. So the only things we live in are stick and mud huts. We will not live in homes that are made of masonry. And there were so many pilgrims visiting as they were starting off their venture together that the townspeople, Francis was away on a preaching tour around central Italy. He was away for several months. Pilgrims kept coming in. They wanted to join the friars. So the local townspeople started building up a home without his permission outside this little chapel. He comes back. He looks at the chapel. He waits a day. The next day, he just jumps on the roof and just starts taking the tiles and throwing them on the ground in front of everybody. And they just started smashing. And they thought, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Right.
It's like, I said you can't live in a house. And I mean that. You will live in stick and mud huts. You can go follow somebody else. But if you're going to follow me, we don't live in homes with walls and roofs. And it was just kind of like, and so they tore the house down.
Wow.
This has been donated by the people of Assisi. They built it with their own hands. They thought they were doing something charitable and loving. We can house your brothers. No. And just that kind of, that sort of radicality has just set a course, a reference point for the church. That's like, oh, like it can go that deep, you know, and that's kind of the way we look at gospel living in many ways. So, so many stories. There's so many anecdotes, so many legends about him. But you know, there is a real Francis. There was a real Francis that was so captivating. Again, he was canonized and draws all these people in pilgrimage to this very day. Inspires people. What we're going to talk about in the next episode is on just sort of the movement. So there's Francis, and then there's people like Claire who were just so attracted to his lifestyle they decided to dictate their entire manner of life after him. So many different Franciscan branches and controversies, and we've had Franciscan popes. We had Pope Francis. So we're just going to talk about his effects on the church, long-lasting. Bishop will be doing that sometime soon. Okay. He's going away for a couple of weeks, but we'll get him back in the studio. But yeah, our next episode will be another Faith Series episode, so it'll be great.
Sounds great.
Thanks for letting me ramble there.
Absolutely.
This one, oh my gosh. Suzanne, great to have you back. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks' time, guys.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Gaudium et Spes podcast. If you would like to know more about our podcast, please visit our website, gaudiumετspes.net, or go to ptdiocese.org and click the button that says podcast. If you listen to the audio version from an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched us on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe or leave us a comment there as well. Thank you for joining us.